Welcome to the latest in our series of public lectures here at Brunel. Welcome if you're from within the Brunel community, from the local community, or indeed if you're from anywhere else in the world. Welcome. Now, I am not the advertised moderator. That was that is, in fact, he's still with us, Professor Danny Nobus, who's the Pro-Vice-Chancellor for External Affairs. Unfortunately, he's been taken ill. And so you're going to have to put up with me. My name's Bill Leahy. I am the Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic, and I'm actually a Shakespeare scholar. So the first thing I want to do this evening, in a talk called Sorting Out Social Care, if you have a look at the full title, I do want to make a point of, first of all, we need to sort out English grammar. There should be a colon between after and the. I'm sure you all noticed that. And for me, that's a grammatical emergency. And we shall be having words with, it wasn't Peter who did it. No, he told me that earlier. So we'll be sorting that out in case any of you are exercised like I am about that. So tonight's lecture then, Sorting Out Social Care, is probably something that touches all of us in one way or another, in the sense that we probably have either loved ones, partners, wives, husbands, family, who are involved in some way with social care. And even if not, then we probably are aware just about every evening on the news, some item is brought for us about social care and the problems, if you like, that the current arrangements in the UK social care system, the current problems that seem to exist. Now, I find it very interesting. I'm very lucky in a way in the sense that, personally, my parents are both very well. I've had very little to do with the social care system, I have to admit. However, my wife is a midwife, and therefore I'm very aware of many of the issues that exist probably across this whole sector. In fact, she tells me about them every night for hours on end, and at the weekends as well. And I find it very interesting. And what she does say that interests me, that I find links with many of these issues as they're brought up in the news, I can relate to a personal experience in one way, and maybe it's not directly relevant, but I think it's an analogy perhaps. I'm the father of two children, two sons. One is 24, one is 12. The first one was, my wife is German. The first son was born in Germany. And it was a very interesting experience in the sense that it was our first child, and the German medical system is very, very well funded, and we're in this beautiful hospital. The facilities were just fantastic. And the whole birth process, if you like, I noticed was a very medicalized one. It was almost industrialized in a sense. Lots of people looking after us, wearing white coats, and I felt very divorced from the whole process myself, very outside of it. Although I felt very, I had a lot of trust, but I just felt very divorced from the whole process. And I think to an extent, amazingly, so did my wife. It felt like almost some kind of medical emergency. Then we came to live over here, and we live in the local community. My wife's a midwife at Hillingdon Hospital, and that's where our second son was born. And it was quite interesting because we were shown the facilities when our son was going to be born and at Hillingdon, and we thought, ugh. Suddenly we've been transported back to the 1970s. The facilities were really pretty grim, and we were a little bit worried about that. And then we went in for the special, 12 hours as it turned out, and it was just us and a midwife. And the midwife, whose name was Priscilla, I remember, came in and said to us, okay, it's just the three of us. Okay, you two have got a lot more to do than I have. Okay, you're going to be working at this. And I felt very, very centrally involved in that whole process, if you like, and it became a very, very human event. It didn't feel like some kind of, she was making some kind of medical intervention. It just felt like some kind of normal human process. And sometimes I think when I think about these social care items that come on the news, sometimes I feel that's how they're being portrayed somehow, that aging or being old is somehow divorced from normal life, or having to deal in some way with the social care sector takes you outside of normal everyday life, whereas in fact it's all just part of human life. Now I'm sure Peter's going to be, with a title such as this, Peter's going to be talking about that sort of issue and many others, and so I'm sure we're all looking forward to that. Now I'm going to have to walk over to there and read from Peter's bio because there's so much to say. There's so many big words. But before I do, let me just say a bit of housekeeping. If you could remember to turn off your mobile phones. And if there is an alarm, it's not a prank, okay? We're not expecting any alarms. So if the fire alarm goes off, please just make your way to the nearest exit. Now, to introduce Peter. So Professor Peter Beresford, OBE. He was awarded the OBE in 2007. He's a Professor of Social Policy here at Brunel University, London. And he's also Director of the Centre for Citizen Participation. It's the first big word. I should get that one. His particular areas of focus are public, patient and server user involvement in policy and practice, democratization and participatory approaches to research, particularly in relation to user-controlled and user involvement research. He has a long-standing involvement in issues of participation and service user involvement in research and evaluation, as writer, researcher and educator. His areas of particular interest are disability, mental health, palliative care, social work and social care, welfare reform, social work education, and participatory research. He's an academic who is also actively involved in the development of policy, practice, and research through affiliations and strong networks with national and international research, policy, practice and service user organisations and structures. His involvement in policy and practice development has a particular focus on social care and social work. He has been a member of many government and non-statutory committees and is currently a trustee of the National Skills Academy for Social Care and member of the Department of Health's Ministerial Forum for Social Care Leadership and Workforce Recruitment and Retention Group. He's a fellow of the NIHR School for Social Care and is also chair of Shaping Our Lives, the national user-controlled organisation and network concerned with the strategic development of user involvement and improved service quality in health and social care. He has published widely in his fields of interest and writes regularly in The Guardian. Now, I did notice, preparing for tonight's lecture, that one of his, amongst his many interests is, quote, sitting in cafes. I think we're all with you there, Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Peter Beresford.
Thank you, Bill. Now, I've got a confession to make, and Bill's already been in the confessional, so I feel it's okay for me to do the same, which is that I am the opposite of a multitasker. And people will know that I've been working on the principle that if I waited long enough, PowerPoint would go away. And it is kind of happening, but not quite tonight. The difficulty for me as a non-multitasker is I've got to say what I've got to say and press the button, sometimes at the same time. And I will find that difficult. but I don't think I can really expect anybody else to do it, so please, everybody, can you bear with me in this difficulty? I want to say hello to everybody. I particularly want to say hello to everyone for coming out on a really unpleasant night like this. It gives you an enormous sense of responsibility, but I think our subject is one that is invested, or should be invested, with a sense of such responsibility. It's great to see you all here, and I really do mean that, and it's great to be kicking off a series of public lectures with a subject which I believe demands priority, but as I think Bill's been suggesting, rarely gets it, particularly in a good way. And I know that a formal setting like this, however brilliant it is, and it's a lovely space, may not be an easy starting point, but I hope that this can be the kind of conversation, it's called a lecture, where together we can help open up, with Bill's support, a discussion that can extend and maybe even continue after we've left this place. Because this is a discussion, for me, about what I believe is one of the most important, yet most neglected public policies in the UK, what has come to be called, as we've been hearing, social care. How, as a society, putting it simply, we look after each other. If we need some support in our lives, as we grow older, if we have a troubled childhood, our parents have difficulties, we are disabled, have a chronic or even life-limiting condition. It's this contradiction, this paradox, this opposites, that's something that's, Bill said it, that's so close to home for so many, if not all of us, and those we love, can seem to have so little importance that both concerns and fascinates me. And that's why we're here this evening. Now, last month, I went to the graduation ceremony of one of our daughters, Ruth, at Sheffield University. It was a lovely day. We had lunch at her school, sociology, met her friends and tutors, and she'd organised for us to go out to tea, and that was fun. There were 3 generations of our family present, one of whom is here tonight, Catherine, and that also included baby Isabel. It felt like a day of enormous achievement all round. Graduations themselves, as people here will know or be hoping, are a major organisational undertaking, but what they're really about is the enormous amount of hard work and sheer grind that the graduates who receive their awards and the families and friends who come to cheer them on have all put in to make it such an important day in so many lives. And I thought about it and the part it plays in many of our lives as one of our rites of passage, as one of our kind of bus stops in our life's journey, and how much we are encouraged to think of our lives in these terms of steps forward, of achievements, a trajectory, a direction, a journey. And there were, of course, on that day, speeches at the graduation ceremony from the Chancellor, as we have here, and from the novelist and critic Philip Hensher, who was being awarded an honorary degree, and they echoed this sense. And in their comments, both of them highlighted what an important stage this was in students' lives and wished them every success in what they'll go on to do, giving them advice about what might help. And it stuck in my mind, Philip Hensher, for example, told them to have cheek in going for what they wanted in their lives. And the Chancellor reminded them that they were now part of a big community that could give them strength, that was a resource, as we all here, in one sense or another, are part of a community, communities. Now, we all know that there are some certainties in life. We are born and we die, but we also seek to make the most of what comes in between. We try, of course, to give life meaning. We work to secure our place in the world. We have ambitions, we have goals, hopes and dreams. We have faith, we have values. We hope to gain insight and understanding. We make friends, we form relationships, we gain partners, we get married. Now we can all get married. We have hobbies and enthusiasms. We work, we get jobs, we hope for careers. We aspire to achievements, awards, prizes, honours, just as at Ruth's graduation. But there do also seem to be some things, and I think Bill's already hinted at this, we gloss over. We gloss over it if things go wrong for us. We don't want to hear so much if people have impairments or become disabled. Expectant mothers are tested for Down syndrome, and there's an expectation that they will have an abortion if the result is positive. Few of us think that mental health problems are something to advertise. The way people talk about them, the way they are treated in the media, encourage us to keep quiet. And then perhaps most of all, the frailty that may come with age, the physical frailty, the mental frailty, can be something it's very difficult for many of us to acknowledge, to speak about, to deal with. And perhaps that's not surprising. We live in a society that I think unarguably is both disablist and ageist. So it's interesting how often the later years in people's lives may be carefully overlooked, cut off, elided from their histories. And we see this of the public figures whose obituary photographs, and I have to say, as I've got older, I spend more and more time looking at obituaries, whose obituary photographs are always of them in their prime, not as they last were. And sometimes the curtain is pulled back a little, as recently I saw when the film star, glamorous Anita Ekberg, famous as the ice goddess, was reported to have died in poverty, or when a pop star dies and we're told that their last years were overshadowed by dependence on drugs or alcohol or by Alzheimer's. What I'm saying is that all of this goes against the grain of popular storytelling, popular narratives. This is not how we were told as children in fairy tales and storybooks. They tend to frame things in terms of ending up somewhere good, better. As I've said, boy meets girl or boy, falls in love, has happy families, and lives happily ever after. Youngster goes to school, works hard, gets job, works hard, gets promoted, becomes a valued citizen, respected and admired. It's an upward line on the graph. We are meant to go out on a high note. But surely our last years, our last days, which may not be as simple as that, are rather more important than something to ignore or to pretend sometimes doesn't happen, because they are where we get to, where everything is headed. They are our destination. Do we do constant mental conjuring tricks, pretending that they aren't there, don't happen to us or other people, that isn't the full-time result, the final score? I've been thinking about this ever since I started to ponder, and I hope everyone else has a chance to do the same. Maybe that's why we go on and on about the stars and celebrities who die young, the James Deans and Marilyn Monroes, who will never grow old, the legends always beautiful, always sexy. But that's Hollywood, you could say, a bit childish, where all that adult movies has ever meant is porn. More often in the films, and this is from my careful reading of Hollywood and the rest, we're A-OK, everything's all right. And then if something goes wrong, we may get some strange disease, let's call it Hollywooditis. We show perhaps some signs of tiredness. We may retire tidily to our bed. Our family is all around us. We fall asleep, our eyes flicker and shut, and then it's closing credits. And I sometimes wonder, and I'm serious now, if that's one of the reasons for the current polarized media discussion about assisted dying, which is a very complex subject. It's difficult, I think, to come to a simple conclusion about. This desire to avoid all these possibilities of losing control by having help to take ourselves out while we may still feel that we're ahead, feeling we're able to keep control, that control right to the end. But if it can be difficult for some of us in the West to be truthful with ourselves about the realities of being or becoming disabled, of growing old and frail, then it certainly doesn't seem difficult for politicians and policymakers to feed into that fantasy. What else, I'm saying, explains the amazingly low priority, as I've said, that the dedicated policy here to address these issues, social care, actually has? Such low profile, such low priority. Healthcare, we know, is a major public priority in our society. You can only think about it, particularly now coming an election. Beware any political party that might be seen as putting the NHS at risk. We are concerned about our health, our children's and families' health, but somehow social care has been separated off from all this. We cling to an NHS that is universal, free at the point of delivery and paid for, at least in theory, all these things out of general taxation. A broken leg, a heart attack, an accident, an injury. We have that in our sights. We know about those things. We have a sense we are covered. But if we have longer-term care needs, then it's means and needs tested. We can expect to pay. We may not be eligible or qualify. I'm suggesting that social care is the 19th century poor law alive and well in the 21st century. Researchers often indicated that many people don't even realise this and think social care is a seamless service that's included all as part of the overall NHS. They find out something very different if and when something may go wrong for them or someone close to them. Then they find out that these two things are indeed very different worlds. It's as if policymakers and politicians have been able to trade on our desire not to think about where our lives may be heading as we get older, acquire impairments, need support. If we put our heads in the sand, they've obviously been equally happy to oblige and keep their heads in the sand about social care. So a policy that's concerned with offering help and assistance at what can be our most traumatic, difficult and vulnerable times, when life can seem most out of control and we are subject to change we may not have prepared for, envisaged, may not understand, where we might need help with the most intimate, personal, private and taboo-ridden aspects of our lives, from childhood to older age, is treated like the most marginal of public policies, given low political and economic priority. Its workforce is paid a pittance, given little value or respect, and too often, it seems, from the frequent reports of abuse, institutionalization, neglect and bad treatment, service users are treated even worse. And that's another of the paradoxes for me, that workers who engage in some of the most intimate, complex relationships with us at some of the most vulnerable and difficult times and stages in our lives as care workers are viewed as so marginal. Most paid the minimum wage or even less, despite many still showing the most amazing levels of dedication and concern. Even the current Health Minister, Norman Lamb, that's him there, has said that the wages of some care workers were, quotes, completely unacceptable and a disgrace. Now this draws me back to George Orwell, the social commentator and the writer, his reflections on the purpose and value of work in his Down and Out in Paris and London, which he wrote 80 years ago. He asked if particular jobs were actually necessary to civilization and if work was virtuous just because it was hard and disagreeable. He condemned what he called the fetishization of work, making work into our master, as it were, particularly pointless and unnecessary work, resulting in what he saw as the perpetuation of useless work. At the heart of all this, what George Orwell saw was a political fear of what people would do if they weren't occupied by work. And he felt that money was seen to justify everything. What he wrote in 1933, to me at least, still seems to hold very much today. Money has become the great test of virtue, he wrote. This is what he said. Beggars do not work, it is said, but then what is work? A navvy works by swinging a pick, an accountant works by adding up figures, a beggar works by standing out of doors in all weathers and getting varicose veins, chronic bronchitis, etc. It is a trade like any other, quite useless, of course, but then many trades are quite useless. And as a social type, a beggar compares well with scores of others. He is honest compared with the sellers of most patent medicines, high-minded compared with a Sunday newspaper proprietor. There's a bit of a resonance to that now, I think. I think many of us would agree with his judgment, but care and support workers, I would suggest, are a very different kettle of fish. It was Sir Andrew Dilnot who, when asked to review the funding of social care, and he's an economist, the policy that's the focus here today, highlighted that this was the public policy of all public policies which, as he said, had to address the most uncertainty in our lives. He said in his review, which was published in 2011, "We estimate that a quarter of people aged 65 will need to spend very little on care over the rest of their lives. Half can expect care costs of up to £20,000, but 1 in 10 can expect costs," I knew I'd forget, here we are, "of over £100,000. Some could spend hundreds of thousands of pounds. There is no way of predicting in advance what the costs might be for any one person. We know that for those who are born with a disability, an impairment, or who develop a care and support need during their working life, lifetime costs will be considerably higher." He said, "Currently, individuals cannot protect themselves against the risk of very high care costs by pooling their risk. In areas such as motoring and housing, people buy private insurance to pool their risk and cover themselves against exposure to high costs. For healthcare, the NHS pools risks by providing social insurance to everyone. For care costs, however, the state does not provide universal support and people are unable to take out private protection. This is the only major area in which everyone faces significant financial risk, but no one is able to protect themselves against it. And the situation has not changed in the years since." We often think of youngsters leading the riskiest of lives. The riskiest times of our life seem to be when we are older, where the risks remain the highest and little is done to make them less, to mediate them. The appalling irony is that the time of most risk is when policy is weakest. And it's really worse than that, because the risks we run in relation to disability and aging are not just personal risks. They aren't just individual tragedies or isolated events in anyone's life. They have social relations. They are connected with bigger things. They may have social origins and causes. In many cases, they are not randomly distributed in society. They can and do vary according to class, culture, income, occupation, education, ethnicity, gender, and other factors. Things then aren't just in the lap of the gods. We can make a difference. We can support children and families with good childcare and child protection services, or stigmatise and neglect them. We can undermine people's health and well-being with long-term consequences through poor quality, insecure employment, long hours that discourage exercise and relaxation, a food industry that encourages obesity and bad diet, and deregulating alcohol and gambling so that people can become dependent on both. Or we can do the opposite. Most important, we can mediate the risks of age and disability through providing customised support that increases choice and control, keeps us secure and safe through crises and emergency, which prevents problems getting worse, people then losing confidence and capacity. These are the things that social care can and should be doing, but often, too often, isn't. Instead of denying and ignoring aging and disability, we can better address them both individually and collectively, as they may affect us personally and by developing responsive policy and provision. This isn't to deny, I'm not going to gloss over the difficulties, but also not to create and perpetuate frightening, distorting, nightmare scenarios and fantasies and stereotypes about this part of the condition of human beings. There is much joy to be had, even facing the difficulties that come with frailty, impairments, and chronic conditions. But we must stop denying how things may end and instead do something about it. I'm saying that impairment and long-term conditions do not have to be destroyers. Take Dorrit Deck, who I read about just a bit earlier this year. That's Dorrit as a young woman. Dorrit Deck was a graphic designer, printmaker, and painter who died last December 29th aged 97. As a Jew, she had fled her native Austria when it was invaded by the Nazis, and she made her mark as part of the golden age of post-war UK post-war design, which include producing a mural for the Festival of Britain and designing many public information and other posters and book covers that epitomised the quirkiness, the confidence, the optimism of that age. And as her obituary said, even after a stroke in 2001 that meant she had to use a wheelchair and could not move her right hand, Dorrit continued to create a piece of abstract or figurative art every day with the help of her beloved and devoted carer, Mary Mendes. She pleaded to everyone to give her any kind of rubbish so she could mess around making joyous collages. She was her own severest critic and often would cut up her work to recycle it for another piece. Wearing trademark stripy socks, she was thrilled, just got to check my numbers here, sorry. She was thrilled to receive young visitors, and they found her a stimulating and inspirational role model. Though latterly virtually housebound, she remained curious, devouring news of the latest architecture and exhibitions from the world outside. Her youthful passion, indomitable spirit, and sharp wit stayed with her until the end. And what I'm saying is that's how many more of our lives could be, something to enjoy and celebrate to the end, rather than screen off and pretend weren't overshadowed by difficulties and the lack of support to negotiate them to the best of our ability as a society. Now let me tell you about Graham, a friend of mine, and Maureen. This is Graham and Maureen on their wedding day. They've been married for just over 50 years. Maureen, who's now 71, was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease and attendant dementia in 2010. Graham is blind, has long been blind, and she was admitted to a care home in 2013 because they could no longer manage at home. Graham says it's a welcoming environment, the home, and the carers are lovely people, but it's meant that if Graham isn't there, and he visits every day, she will spend all her time in bed. There isn't an appropriate room for her to sit in, and if she sits in a chair in her own room, they have been told that a member of staff has to be there, and there is never one to spare. As Graham says, she seems to enjoy sitting down, she can't verbalize her feelings, and staying in bed raises respiratory issues which seem to distress her. She just weeps, he says, when she stays in bed. So in 2015, we can get a spaceship onto a small rock in space, but we cannot provide, it seems, the basics routinely to ensure an essential quality of life for an older person, despite the commitment of staff and the fact that unlike many residents, Maureen has family to visit and help out. And my simple question is why? Is it just because we don't want to face up to the issues that social care is meant to address? And I think perhaps that has a part to play. But from the evidence, there seems also to be much more mundane forces at work. Ever since the Sutherland Commission on Long-Term Care reported in 1999, with its initial recommendation for free social care, which was rejected by the then government, the response of the three main traditional political parties has consistently been that we could not afford to put social care on the same footing as the NHS and make it a universal service, free at the point of delivery, funded by general taxation. This continues to be the essential position of the three main political parties. At the time, Sir Stuart Sutherland, chair of the Commission, said that social care would not work for all unless this was done. Without such a measure, he said, problems would persist over the boundaries of healthcare and social care. And we've since seen that he was right. Now, while some politicians, like the Coalition's former Care Minister, Paul Burstow, have sought to deny that there is what's called what is a social care funding problem. He said that there wasn't a funding gap, that's the way it's expressed, between what people might need and what was provided. More generally, both the evidence and political statements have highlighted the chronic underfunding of social care. The Dilnot Commission certainly acknowledged this. Going back to Mr. Dilnot, but the argument has been that it's not possible politically or economically to change this. There's been a search, as there so often is in modern politics, to find private money to make up the difference, but this continues to fail in social care. There is a political and populist desire to continue to make people pay for it themselves, as we will still see with the Care Act due in April. But this doesn't actually seem to work, with the population increasingly finding it difficult even to meet the financial requirements of ensuring that they have an adequate pension. Now, I've been in the room, I've heard major politicians say that it just isn't possible to give social care greater financial priority, and that the only reason that the NHS can be given it is because it was already there. Interestingly, consistently, the only voices that call for social care support to be available as on the same terms of the NHS are service users, carers, and their organisations. Everyone else seems to rule it out still as a pipe dream, impossible, and as I was once told, based on an assumption that I must believe in Santa Claus. I should stress, not true. Alongside the tooth fairy and a sense of the essential honesty and altruism of politicians, this is a belief I had to leave at base some time ago. But why do we think of looking after people as a financial burden? We do need to be asking these questions, these basic, simple questions, the kinds of troubling questions that children are good at asking. What underpins this way of thinking? That it's a matter of money out rather than money in. Why is it thought that helping to support children facing difficulties, disabled and older people, is a negative rather than a positive? Long ago, we know the NHS was established, grounded in the belief that taking care of the nation's health was an investment in the nation's future. Now, forget for the moment that we might think that there could be a moral duty to take care of each other in an advanced modern society. Surely the long-standing lesson has been that a healthy nation is a productive and competitive nation. Isn't this the overarching meaning of investing in people? Even the supporters of social care sometimes seem to see it in this prevailing negative way I've been talking about, as a cost, but one that they would argue is at least worth paying for, though. But that's not an argument that's likely to carry too much weight with many politicians, unfortunately. But there's a different way of thinking about this. Jerry Zarb, for example, the disabled activist and theoretician, has, over a period of years, set out the gains from supporting the full social inclusion of all disabled people in a society. As he has said, discussion has been restricted by the tendency of existing approaches to expenditure on supporting disabled people to be seriously limited by, as he puts it, the narrow focus on individual investment decisions, as typified, for example, by the process of assessment for social care, and a very narrow focus on the costs to public finances. This rules out any meaningful discussion of overall costs and benefits. As he says, by increasing disabled people's participation in social and economic life would reduce their reliance, the reliance of many, and the associated costs on family carers, social security, and segregated services. It could maximise many more people's social and economic contribution. It would require the removal of barriers to education, to transport and employment, but that would bring its own longer-term economic and social benefits, as we see when any other set of barriers begin to be removed. It would also offer broader benefits associated with a civilised society, helping to ensure the social justice that we proclaim and full civil and human rights for all its citizens. Now, some may say that this argument doesn't apply equally to older people who've outlived their economic usefulness. Tell that to the many young parents in today's world who are increasingly relying on grandparents for childcare to be able to keep working. Are we saying that older people don't pay taxes, that most haven't paid income tax as employees over a lifetime and won't continue to generate tax revenues in other ways until the day of their death, and indeed after, with their taxable funerals? We also know that the cruelly penny-pinching approach to social care funding has disastrously negative, perverse results. It undermines any hope for policies for prevention, leaving people's situation, health and well-being to deteriorate, ending up at an even greater cost to the government, to the exchequer, even if we put to one side, and I think we should not, the costs to human happiness. Currently, as people know, as Bill said, we are seeing its wasteful effects on the NHS, on accident and emergency departments, with so-called bed blocking and much suffering. As Jerry Zarb has suggested, an economy geared to the equal living of disabled people, and indeed all our well-being, would demand a different kind of accountancy for calculating economic success. But we already have evidence to help us do that. Social care in the UK, as we have seen, has long been devalued, as I've said, with most workers paid around the minimum wage, receiving little training or support or career opportunities. And that's also resulted in an unhelpful over-reliance on migrant workers. Social care, we've seen, is treated by policymakers as a low priority, for which adequate investment is not politically feasible. We should again remind ourselves that it's this policy on which millions of older and disabled people are reliant, and which any of us may need to turn to one day. An independent analysis of the economic value of the adult social care sector in England, and here I'm afraid I can only share the language of economists, which I don't fully understand, but as economists are valued much more than people like social workers and social care workers, I'm assuming that this has real credibility, which it seems to do. As this economic independent analysis of the economic value showed, the direct economic value in 2011 to 12 of social care was more than £20 billion. Its indirect effects are estimated to add a further £16 billion of what they call GVA, gross value added, to the English economy, and support a further 1 million full-time equivalent jobs. It employs 1.5 million workers and produces around £13,250 of this GVA, gross value added, per worker. It contributes 1.8% of all GVA, gross value added, in England, and provides jobs for 6.4% of the total workforce in England. Investment in social care can be seen to put a stop to both human and financial waste. Similar calculations we know can be made for other public services in the UK and other countries, for health, education, welfare benefits, housing and so on, demonstrating their contribution to the existing economy as well as to our well-being. They can be seen to create jobs, skills, opportunities, and also overseas markets and investment. Yet these social policies have been increasingly presented as inefficient, their funding cut, and their workers attacked as a net drain on, rather than benefit to, the economy and society. But the present model of an economy posited based on growth, the idea of growth, we hear about growth every time the reports come in, created by increased consumption, is increasingly also being shown to be unsustainable and socially destructive. The kind of switch in economic priorities I'm suggesting would also benefit from careful re-examination of what is meant by well-being and welfare. Such terms have long been taken over, appropriated by professional experts, and this trend continues to the present. But work's also begun to develop, to enable people themselves with knowledge that comes from experience as disabled people, as older people, as mental health service users. But I'm talking particularly here about older people, to say what such terms mean for them. And significantly, in a big project we carried out, when we talked to many older people, they framed well-being in terms of connectedness, health, occupation and activity. They also emphasised the importance of approaches to supporting their well-being that are based on their involvement, their participation, rather than having things done for them or to them. This, as we've seen, has been the distinguishing feature of exciting new user-led, user-controlled services and support. So I'm suggesting that reconceiving social care as an economic generator with a primary concern with people's well-being offers the prospect of an economy that does not have to be based on growth, with all the environmental and social problems which it's increasingly being recognised to bring in its wake. It would take account of significantly changing demographics, resulting in more older and disabled people, and our increasing requirements for support during the life course. Instead of seeing social care as all about deficit and consumption, we can see it instead as positive and creative, not in terms of consumption, but in terms of production. Supporting, maintaining, and improving people's well-being would thus become a central aim of economic activity, prioritising the creation of valued employment and careers to support people's well-being, developing learning and skills to support such a workforce, encouraging research, development and innovation to achieve these objectives. I think we're actually at the cusp of having to recognise this because of the demographic change, but of course there's always the reluctance of policymakers and the problem of political timescales. But such a needs-based and person-centred approach would value us all equally and be concerned with our well-being, whatever our role, worker, service user, or simply citizen. It would begin, I'm suggesting, to revalue all of us to the good of us all. Thank you.
So thanks very much for that, Peter. There was a bottle here, but maybe you're used to taking your own bottle. So thanks very much for that really interesting talk. Now, it's very important that we want to open it out to questions and get as many people asking questions as we can, and we'll turn to that in a moment. Before we do, can I just ask you a question? Is there a moment, so I'm speaking from a position of ignorance now, is there a moment when you think the social care system went wrong, if you like, in this country? Was there a time when it was functioning well and then it went wrong?
That's a very difficult question to answer in a just way. I think the problem really is that the people who created the welfare state, who were worthy, well-intentioned people, but did not have an idea, by and large, from what research I've been able to do, that what works best is what involves people. So basically, they were setting down policies which they felt would work. They had this sense that many of the issues that we now see as the subject of social care would go away. They thought that as the health service came into operation, as people had better living standards, as we had pensions and social security and full employment, that problems of old age, as they'd understood them, and the attendant putting of people into big institutions, that problems of people acquiring or being born with impairments would wither away. And because I think they thought that mistakenly, because the opposite has happened, they didn't, as it were, develop a specific service of social care. So what actually happened was that the founding NHS, much more than now, included aspects which we would see as part of social care. And local authorities were left with bits and pieces from the poor law days, which they were meant to sort out. But that didn't really work. And if there was a time when things changed, I think it's probably the late 1970s, because there were some really good things happening in social care, a bit hit and miss depending on where you lived, and innovations that didn't take place. But it was moving, especially if we look at something like domiciliary care, care for people living at home, it was moving to an increasing recognition that perhaps the service should be free and available to people on the basis of what needs they had. Then, of course, we had a big political shift in the late 1970s, and social care significantly became a kind of a leader in ideological change, and now we had a market-driven model of social care, and more people were having to pay for it. So if there was one point where maybe we took a wrong road, that could have been it. But this is I'm sure many other people would have different views.
Okay, well, thanks for that. I was looking today on the government.uk website around social care, and the word that kept jumping out at me really was dignity. Now, I assume you would regard that as some kind of political, rhetorical smokescreen, really, that sort of covers up the reality. Which country would you hold up as the model of getting this right, the social care system?
I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't try in any sense of being chauvinistic either of here or of any other country. I don't know that anyone's got it absolutely right. I think as can be noted and has been noted by some people, the division, the separation, the break, the fragmentation that there is between health and social care is not anything like as bad in some European countries. But this point about dignity, I think I really should kind of like follow up on the Graham and Maureen story, because I wanted to make sure that they were comfortable. It would be difficult for Maureen to give a full informed consent, but that Graham was comfortable with me using those photographs and speaking about them. And he said he was, but he gave me an update. And this is what he said. And if people don't mind, I'll read this out. I got this on the 13th. You will know that last week I had to defend Maureen's care being provided under continuing health care in their annual review. And he previously told me how painful that was. We disagreed about the time needed to feed Maureen, a person with Parkinson's and advanced dementia. When we feed Maureen, I think he means the family, it takes us about an hour. The nurse from the home confirmed that they would not have the resources to take this time and volunteered 20 minutes. The time allocated by continuing health care for moderate need was 30 minutes plus. The outcome was that the care staff now have to record how long it takes to feed Maureen. They are recording as low as 10 minutes for giving Maureen a dinner and sweet. I believe this to be harmful and wrong and have registered to see the home manager. We call this civilised behaviour. Hope all goes well on Monday. Now, and thanks to Graham. Well, I thought about this when I talked about this with my partner. I don't take 10 minutes to eat my lunch or my dinner. And if we're realistic about what it means and how long feeding with grace and dignity would take, then I have to say that what I don't think policymakers, and we can say this knowing that this is not a party political issue. I mean, that's the point. It's not a party political issue. I don't think policymakers have got their heads around this yet. I don't think it's something that they've been able to engage with adequately. And I know I've met many of these ministers, and I'm sure that they are all decent people at heart. And I think when they see any individual, they do not want to be part of things that are going desperately wrong. But things are going desperately wrong, and they're not going desperately wrong on an isolated incident basis. We know that issues of 0-hour contracts and 15 minutes sessions for care and support are very commonplace, don't we? And that cannot be associated with a service that provides dignity.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Peter. So let's open it up to questions now. Now, we have two people with microphones, so if you have a question, please put up your hand, and one of the colleagues will come and hand the microphone to you. If you speak closely into the microphone. So this lady here.
Hello, Genevieve Hibbs, PhD, Brunel. You have hinted at prevention, but the NHS has never been about prevention. And if perhaps at the beginning of the NHS, if there had been prevention, would we be in a very different place now than we are? And could we actually get onto a track of prevention rather than treatment? Thank you.
Shall I respond to that?
Yes, please, please.
I mean, I think that's a profoundly wise question, and I think we talk so often about an NHS that's concerned with acute and cure. And just like I think those who set us on the road to the road we have now in the 1940s did really conceive of the NHS, generally speaking, as being curative, but life has not become like that, let alone if it ever was. So I think it has put us on a false track. So we have an NHS which still people frequently say trains people, trains its leaders to think in curative short-term terms, and social care, which we know there is an increasing need for, which is marginalised. And it is a perfect storm of unhelpfulness. I remember I was part of a commission that was organised by one county, Hampshire, looking at future developments for social care. And at one of the sessions that they had to take evidence, a man was present who was himself by now very old, this was not long ago, who had been a GP at the time of the change to the NHS. And what he said was a precursor of comments that people make now. He said, when I was in the NHS in those days, we did not talk about things like Alzheimer's as something which wasn't our province. We did not say it was a social condition rather than a medical one. But I think the fact that there have been many years of financial difficulties with the NHS, with the culture it has had, and the sense that it was under pressure, and then this idea that there is a separate social care, more and more got pushed off. So we have some really unhelpful and arbitrary distinctions, and we have some problematic cultural differences. And I always have to say, I respect the person who writes in private eye as MD, who is a general practitioner, because I've heard him speak, and what was helpful about him talking about the National Health Service was he was someone who wanted to defend it against unhelpful developments, but absolutely was honest and truthful about all that's been wrong with it. That's the mindset we want. That's not an easy mindset to have in a political circumstance. But of course, I think you're absolutely right, and there need to be these kinds of conversations at a political level.
Thanks, Peter. The middle of the back row there, please.
Hi there. I work for the Care and Support Alliance, which Shaping Our Lives is a member of, and it's a national campaign of major charities campaigning for more funding for social care. Essentially, we think that's the underlying, one of the main issues, and would help solve the other things that you've brought up. What I wanted to ask is, you've talked about integration and how that's got to be, that's also another key to making things better. Now, the government and all the parties, they love the word integration, they love personalisation, they love choice, all these slogans, and they are making some steps towards integration, but we think without the money behind it, it's not going to work. I'm wondering, how do you think we can convince them what more is needed? Because another thing that we hear is, as you talked about, safe to spend, basically. Safe to spend arguments are not popular, they don't seem to hold any currency right now. And what we hear is, there's not enough evidence for that. And I have to say, working in this area, there are small-scale case studies, there are some hints, there's a lot around, discharge from hospital being linked to social care, but less maybe about working-age disabled people. The evidence there can be harder to find, so what do you think it will take? And related to that, if money was no option, what would be the first step that you would take to improve the system?
Well, that was a straightforward and simple question to address. That really is, I think, summing up some of the very key things that we need to take account of if we're serious about social care. And I have to say that one of the things I've learned from being involved in a service user disabled people's organisation is that you're constantly having to look in two directions at once, and you're having to have two notions of change in your head. So we are part of this strategic partnership with the Department of Health, alongside lots of other third sector organisations, the aim of which is to try and improve understanding and communication between the grassroots and government. So we're needing to sort of gain and acquire, which I think we've done very well, the skills to be able to communicate in ways that governments can hear, and also get to know what they find difficult to hear, while also be true to what we're hearing from the grassroots, which are very, very painful things. The other thing you have to keep in your mind is that change, I think, can be seen to happen in two ways at two critical levels. There's trying to achieve change politically, which we all struggle for, but I have to say in the context of mental health policies and social care policies, I think I've seen the most difficult resistance, probably because I think governments in relation to social care are so frightened of it. And when, before the last election, and I'm not trying to be party political here, Labour tried to argue for something different and did get agreement from the Lib Dems at the time. This was called the death tax by the Conservatives, and it was dead in the water, and it was not, crudely put, a death tax. So I think if our focus is simply on trying to make the policymakers change their minds, it's a very difficult task, and I fear sometimes that the only way they will learn is when the demographic changes and voting relating to them makes it inescapable for them. But there is another kind of change, which I think many of us will be familiar with in this room, which is very important, underestimated, and I believe leads to most of the real change that ever takes place in our world. And that's the change within us, especially within those of us who face difficulties, discrimination and oppression. And I think that what we could talk about in relation to disability and old age is no different from those issues that have been raised since the last quarter of the 20th century by other identity-based politics and campaigns of the women's movement, black civil rights, LGBT communities, which is that, first of all, we, all of us inside us, if we're experiencing some kind of exclusion or problem, we need to gain a better understanding of that and then begin to exert pressure. That's what leads, in my opinion, to fundamental change. And we need to try and couple the two. The research we did a large research project funded by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, and what that saw as two really big barriers to the radical improvement of social care, which I've tried to touch on, were one, funding change, as you've said and I've said, but also cultural change, and they both have to be there. Just doing more of the same, not changing the culture, further medicalising social care, or just trying to inject some more community into an unreconciled NHS is not going to work. There has to be fundamental cultural change, and I think the people who are most going to input that will be the people who, from their lived experience as service users, as older people, disabled people, whatever, will keep hammering away, in a good sense, to policymakers and politicians.
Thank you. There's a question here, Justin.
Thank you, Peter. It's a fascinating talk. You've been very critical of politicians and policymakers, and they're a soft and easy target. But I wonder if the problem is actually not the politicians and the policymakers, but us, the electorate, because the history of welfare in this country is one of exponential need and desire for more care and more welfare. And there comes a point when we as a society have to decide what the state can reasonably provide. Now, I absolutely understand your point, and there may be some judgments to be had about the balance, whether there should be more in the NHS, more in social care. But surely the difficulty is that when the state provides it, the electorate just wants more and more and more, and we as a society have to decide what we will provide and what we won't.
And you're right to raise that question, and it's a sensible reminder that there's nothing we should be taking for granted here. I have to be honest, I thought I was being incredibly kind to politicians. Well,
Politicians enable things that happen.
Right.
Without politicians, there'd be no NHS.
You may say that. I couldn't possibly comment. But your point, I think, makes some presumptions. You know, you're assuming that I'm saying, or people are saying, we can't look after each other. That's the phrase for me, looking after each other. My phrase is not the state's got to look after us. But what's problematic, and I see it in my own life and experience, is that in a very complex, increasingly complex society, where curiously enough, we are having to work longer hours with more uncertainty and stress, those things which could make it more possible for us to support each other are being undermined. I mean, I only have to look at my own family, where I and my partner have 4 daughters, the nearest of whom, Catherine, lives 25 miles away, the other 3 of whom, because of the price of housing, live in the north of England. So a bane of our lives is how much contact we can have with our children. And there's been a big shopping expedition taking place today to enable 2 of our grandchildren to be with us from Leeds. And that's not just us. I'm not mentioning it because of us. What's important about us is we're unremarkable. That the pressures of housing, the pressures of jobs, the pressures of all sorts of other social structural issues are making it more and more difficult for us to be caring of each other. And I know that one of the helpful discussions that's taking place in relation to the idea of unpaid carers is it's not going to work in the future. People have been doing the maths about women who've taken on the brunt of that responsibility, especially if services have been reduced rather than increased. Services have been reduced over the years, not increased. How are they going to do it? How are they going to do it when they are 70 and the person they're to look after is 90? And so on and so on. How are they to do it when they are going to have to be in employment? Perhaps doing not 1 job, but perhaps 2 or possibly 3. So the maths is not being done. And I'm not some crude kind of statist, but equally, I'm not some crude kind of neoliberal. And the bit that's my passionate interest is where we as citizens can be in these equations, how we can be more actively involved. And unfortunately, the trend and the tendency is away from us being, except in some privileged areas where ideas like big society might seem to work, is not working well. That's my worry. But I'm with you on the idea of us as citizens being as fully engaged in our lives and our society as possible.
Thanks, Peter. Heinz.
I'm Heinz Wolf. Let me introduce myself. I'm 86 and 3/4. I'm currently Edith Mel. I've very recently been widowed. I have suffered from all sorts of diseases and full of electronics to keep me alive. Now, what I have to say, I mean, in a sense, it has been modified by our speaker's replies recently, that he's put a problem to us, but he hasn't really suggested a solution. And I think he's plain wrong. I mean, one doesn't often say this to it, and I'm sure he will forgive me. If I just ask you to imagine how many washing machines and how many dishwashers there are in the country. Each of them saves time. They have been bought because people have time. If people were to vote the time which they save from their dishwashers and their washing machines to giving a few hours of care to neighbors and friends and people who live in the same street, the problem would appreciably be reduced or even go away. And as some of you will know, I'm working on a scheme where social care essentially becomes a responsibility of society and not of the state. I do not believe that in any country, in Europe or in America or China even, that the state has enough resources to deal with the extension of lifespan of people. The fact that there will be a good deal of people whose final years require a quite astonishing amount of care when they get into dementia. So I believe that to look to the state is a mistake. That is, the solution is not political. The solution is that we look after each other. You have said a number of times. And we do that in a manner where we do a few hours a week, 5 hours a week, to somebody who lives at the corner of the street. We store up these hours as a sort of reward on a bank account, in hours, not in money. And when we are old, we draw on this store of hours which we have learned to not finance exactly, but to arrange and fire care. Now, I believe this is the only way of doing it. Call it care for care or give and take or something. It is one generation giving something to the older generation in the expectation that when they take the place of the older generation, it will come back to them for the next younger generation. This is the only way it can be done. And I would like to take social care entirely out of state hands.
Would you like to respond, Peter?
Well, I don't disagree with you, Heinz. I mean, I would see that as part of a patchwork of how we look after each other. I would say two things. One, social care is virtually out of the state's hands. Most of the supply of social care is now in the private sector. It's recognised that most of the best innovations in social care, in terms of offering people the kinds of things that they say they want, tends to come from small organisations, small community-based organisations, small black minority ethnic organisations, small disabled people-led organisations, but the organisations that dominate the marketplace, and it's a very unsatisfactory market, are large organisations, and they also tend to be organisations which are very much at the cutting edge of the kind of new market organisations that we're seeing, like private equity companies, bringing a number of problems with them. So in one sense, social care is outside the state's control. That's why we had the problem with thousands of people with a company going down, being at the mercy of what was going to happen to their lives, when it was impossible even always to find out who had responsibility for particular homes. My point in relation to what you say, which I've already touched on in response to what someone said at the top, is I think if we want it to be possible for people to look after each other in whatever sense, and that sometimes might be that little bit of help which could come from someone close to them or from a scheme like yours, we have to establish a framework to encourage it. And I'm afraid that my sense of the amount of time people are having to work, how stressed and insecure growing numbers of people seem to be, of how people are meant to think of themselves in our world, our society, which I fear is increasingly atomized, I think that those encouragements and that framework isn't there. It needs much more to be built. I don't think any of the people I've ever known who are at the mercy of the inadequacies of social care services or mental health services ever want to hear from somebody who says, I've got the solution, this is it. Because they know that big solutions usually have big problems. So I would certainly not be arguing for that. I'm interested in how we can be helped in all sorts of ways to look better after each other, to take on the joys and the responsibilities of that kind of looking after. Now, I know that sometimes people feel that it's actually better to be looked after by competent strangers than by people close to you, because they don't want that kind of connection in things which may be very private to them, say within the family. But for others, it's very different. There are lots of difficulties and pressures. There are lots of issues around gender and issues around age. And we need to put effort into sorting those out. So I'm with you, but we have to do that too.
I mean, you are of course aware that something of the order of 70% of all care is done by family members who are unsupervised, untrained, and no doubt with the best intentions. They have nothing to look forward to. They give up their jobs, they may give up part of their pension to look after their husband or their wife. And there's nobody to look after them, because this rolling system, which I've just described to you, would actually give them some hope and would give them a degree of guarantee there would actually be another generation to look after them. It's a moment when we are over 20 years or 30 years, longevity has really started to bite. Incidentally, that's to make some of you laugh. With my German accent, I used to say longevity, which means being happier, which may be quite a good trademark for the longevity, idea of the longevity jam or something of the kind. But it has to be us, and it has to be us in the next 2 or 3 years.
I'd really be pleased if other people would chip in in response to some of the comments like Heinz's or yours, so we can open it up a bit. It would be really good, rather than me saying more or another question.
Okay.
Because I think this is at the heart of the matter. I really do.
Okay, we've got time for just another couple of questions. There's a lady there, and then there's one over there, because we need someone from that side of the room.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks very much, Heinz. Just kind of following on from your comment, actually, just to see if I've got this right. The NHS has political purchase because it promotes the idea of physical sufficiency, physical capacity to work, and thereby economic citizenship. Is it your suggestion that if social care were then to be viewed as some sort of moral economy, that we could promote a more socially just form of citizenship, and then it would be valued further? Was that part of your discourse?
I have to give that a lot of thought, Sweater, because I think you're raising sophisticated ideas that I need to think about, and we need to have a conversation about. But I've been doing a lot of work lately trying to make sense of the foundations of the welfare state. And what I find interesting is comparing how people were talking about it then, during the war, before the war, and when they created it, and how we talk about it now. And it's fascinating. When we talk about the welfare state now, all we mean, or all that the media discussion seems to mean, is what they call welfare and welfare reform, which is the benefit system. And then polarized against that, by some of us, there is the discussion, the conversation about the National Health Service. So we have politicians who should be nameless, because I don't want to depart from my non-partisan desire tonight, who will go on and on about defending and improving the National Health Service in this election year. And then we know there are other politicians who will go on and on about how we need to tighten up controls on people who are receiving welfare benefits. And we've been hearing about that this week. We've been hearing about that both from the Minister with direct responsibility and also the Prime Minister in relation to a number of particular groups. When people were talking about the welfare state in those days that when it started, what I've discovered is, first of all, obviously they had an enthusiasm for the state because they'd just gone through the Second World War, where the state seemed to have done quite a good job in enabling us not to be defeated by fascism. But they actually, I think, also meant that we had to have a much more integrated approach to a whole range of values and policies, not least from their point of view, and that's where their moral thinking was, what they saw as full employment. And full employment to them meant able-bodied men being able to have a job as they hadn't been able to have during the time between the two world wars. They were not thinking of women, they were not thinking of disabled people, they were not thinking of the black and minority ethnic population that existed then in our society, before even new people joined us from the Commonwealth. So it was a very particular understanding, but it was a virtuous understanding within their lights, because they thought that if people were able to have a better standard of life through better housing, and we should remember that Aneurin Bevan wasn't just the founder of the health service, he was the founder of good quality council housing, then many problems would go away. So I think they had a sense, which obviously we've moved on to a different plane, but we've got other issues and other problems, that many of the problems which there had been would no longer exist. But I think we should take some leaves out of their book by trying to reinterpret some of the helpful principles that were tied to their time, like full employment. Now, I know many people with chronic long-term conditions and people with mental health difficulties who do not want to be dragooned into any kind of employment. So we're not talking about that. But I don't know many people who don't want to feel that they can make some kind of contribution, have some meaningful occupation in their life. Going back to what I was saying right at the start about a journey. But what saddens me, and here I can get an appropriate dig into your politicians, is the crudity of the political debate about social care. It's at a very crude level. And I think it's people like us who need to help that debate grow and flourish and be more complex and helpful.
Thank you, Peter. So we've got time just for one more question, I'm afraid. There's a young lady.
I'm a support worker and a key worker for people with mental health disorders and some physical disabilities. But it's obvious that social care needs to change. Do you think that there's really much we can do, apart from working with our individuals to the best of our ability? Is there a wide change that we can make, or do you think this can only come from policy changes?
Well, I would want to pick up on that comment of yours, which was almost like a throwaway, but isn't, and you didn't mean it as such, which is just trying to do the job to the best of our ability. And I've seen international research, I've been at events where it's been presented, where people who've talked with service users have talked about the disproportionate and enduring positives of having a good practitioner working with them. So for what might have been for a practitioner, just a period of work over a particular time with one person amongst a number could have a wonderful beneficiary effect for that person. So I think that although it's so easy to be dismissive of the work that social care workers, different professions and the allied workers do as its sticking plaster, I think that's a really unhelpful and degrading thing to say. And my feeling, as someone who's been a service user, is that the contribution a good practitioner can make is beyond measure, and it's a wonderful and virtuous job. And the valuable thing constantly to be doing, which is difficult because the work is so difficult. I've said in print that social care is not like rocket science, it's much more complicated. I think that they need to be listening to what the people they work with say to them. They need to be trying to do what service users, I think, have begun to do better, but I think it's very difficult for practitioners to do, which is to talk more and get support from each other. And the other thing is, like the rest of us, try and keep banging on the door of those policymakers and politicians and sharing our collective knowledge, what I think people wisely call practitioner wisdom. Because just like there's service user knowledge from living something 24/7, there's practitioner wisdom from being on the ground working with people and gaining skills.
Don't you think it's difficult though when people in this sector are kind of slated quite often? Like for example for myself, we have quite little support from our managers if something not goes wrong. I'm not saying anything bad happens, but if there's no support.
Yeah. I agree with you. I mean, speaking as someone whose partner is a social worker, one of whose daughters is a social worker in child protection, which is the area where the most stick is likely to come, I think that we just have to, if we have that commitment to that job, at present, sadly, it goes with the territory. And what it seems to me is the case, that it can go up to kind of middle management, where people can feel support from their management. There is a problem, it seems for me, sometimes with senior management and the structures of social work and social care, and we shouldn't take that as a given. We should more and more interrogate why that is and be challenging of it. But what you say has to be true, and I think that's why some people make a kind of spiritual leave-taking, and people talk about being burnt out, because it is so difficult. And my feeling is it's very easy to be a bad worker in this field and really hard to be a good one. But those who have that commitment and motivation, like I'm sure you do, will just struggle. But it needs to have more public recognition.
Okay, thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for all of your questions. I'm sure we could sit here for another hour or two and still not be at the end of questions. So thank you very much. Now, if you want to carry on the discussion, there is a paying bar outside. It would be great if it was free, but it's not. So please feel free to go out there and carry on the discussion. Now, we have 2 more public lectures in this series. On the 30th of March, we have Sir Mark Walport. The lecture is The Sciences of the 21st Century. On the 20th of April, we have Dame Mary Archer, The Science of Good Health. So it'd be lovely to see you there for those. We also have a continuing series of inaugural lectures. On the 5th of March, we have Professor Bill, oh God, I can never say his name, Boldsopoulos. Yeah, carry on, Bill. That's called The Biomechanics of Human Movement, and on the 26th of March, Professor Rakesh Kanda, Is Our Water Safe? So we hope to see as many of you as possible at those. Let's end this evening. Please, will you join me in thanking our speaker, Professor Peter Beresford.